So, in the previous discussion or previous class session, we were talking about the importance of category management strategy. We highlighted this figure from one of the research that was conducted, the advantage that companies are experiencing because of category management. So, clearly, an 18% increase in EBITDA for a 1% COGS improvement with the help of category management is quite meaningful, and a lot of companies are spending money and time and effort into creating the right strategy. So there are multiple stages that you evolve as you're working on your category management. Typically, initially, you have a cost control mentality. Everything is about bringing down the costs through negotiations with suppliers. But over time, companies realize that that would not be the most optimal approach. So they would consider strategic sourcing options, category optimization, some things that we will be starting with in category management. Things that we are covering today would be part of that. But also going forward into margin management, where we can reduce the cost of the items with the help of the supplier, working with the supplier and cross-functional within the organization, you can find margin improvement, so that we can increase the margin for the supplier, but also for yourself, which is part of our next unit when we will get into cost management and price management. So that's stage three. And then we get into partnerships, supply capabilities, part of our unit four that we will, unit three when we will discuss this part, and then ecosystem value creation. So it's a typical way in which you flow from one stage to the other. We are right now trying to understand how we get into stage two. How do we optimize categories? How do we ensure that we have the right strategy for the type of product we are selling or we are buying? So here is an important partnership that was between Toyota and Panasonic. It's at the stage 5 level where they've gone all the way and created a partnership by leveraging the advantage of both parties. Toyota is known for their automotive expertise, and Panasonic has battery technology expertise because of their partnership with Tesla. So what they did is they created a joint venture, Prime Planet Energy and Solutions, in February 2020. And this has 51% stake of Toyota and 49% of Panasonic. They are actually buyer supplier. And with 5,100 employees, they are actually targeting markets together. So this is an ecosystem that they've created where they are jointly entering markets, trying to find new markets and launching new products. So together they can create a competitive moat, which otherwise they would not have been able to. So this is an interesting story about, how do we ensure that we bring suppliers into creation of ecosystems and create competitive advantage for both parties. Now, how do we create actionable category strategy? We need to have certain things in place. We need to have top management support. Different pieces have to fit together for developing an actionable category strategy. There are three tiers which we will see. One is the executive leadership and sponsorship. The second one is where we have, so in this one, we also have cross-functional collaboration as part of that high-level understanding across different teams. Now, it's very important because without this, everything else falls apart. Then we have in the middle the execution layer, where we use AI technologies that we are discussing in our class also. We engage in supply market intelligence and risk assessment, something which can then help us understand how the market is, what kind of risks exist, something we will talk about soon in subsequent slides. And find ways for collaborating with suppliers, innovating with suppliers. These are important ways in which we can strengthen the overall category management approach. And then at the foundational, at the bottom level, we have the basics, the data governance, data quality, compliance of data based on whatever we need. If there's an ESG expectation, then how do you integrate that, integration of that, total cost of ownership? All these things are to be there at the foundational level, because the goal at the center is a strategy that's data-driven, sustainable, and resilient. And that is only possible when we have all these levels and layers in place. And this ultimately results in a strategy which allows us to get the product at the best possible quality while at the same time having long-term value. It may not be cheap that you'll get the product, but it'll be having longer-term value. So the goal is value creation rather than trying to find a product cheaper than otherwise. So that's sort of what the objective here is. Now, those three levels that we just talked about, if we unpack them, we see that strategic leadership isn't just about having executive sign-offs, because that's something which we could stop at. But it's about having them actively engaged in these category management exercises. When you're talking about creating a $1 billion joint venture that we just saw, or fundamentally reshaping your supply base, then the C-suite needs to be in the room. They need to be informed, and they also need to be actively be part of this category management. And then executive capabilities, this requires some real investments. So if the leadership is involved, then they will invest in AI-powered analytics, market intelligence. So that's why it's sort of important to have those execution capability in conjunction with the strategic leadership. And the foundational layer is the data governance, ESG integration. Any of these levels you skip and your category strategy will basically flounder. So we have to have a multi-pronged approach here. Okay. Now, alignment and linkage, we have talked about this a little bit, but the point here is that when we are creating category management strategy, it has to align with the corporate strategy. So example of cost leadership and differentiation. Now, these are the two strategies I'm sure you have studied in your strategy class, where cost leadership is where the focus of the company is in bringing down the cost. And differentiation is when a company focuses on differentiating itself either by quality of the product or innovation of the products, whatever the case might be, or delivery of products rather fast. So we know that these two companies are quite different in the way they are positioned. One is cost leadership oriented, the other is differentiation oriented. Now, this strategic orientation should then also translate into how the category management strategy will be designed. Right? You have to create a category management strategy which is different in Walmart compared to Apple. How does Walmart operate? What they do is, and I talked about this, that their everyday low prices is actually a operational mechanism. It's a operational system that they have to operate with this kind of approach, which means that they have to work with several suppliers, get volume leverage so that they can get the lowest possible price. They need to use technology to minimize supply chain cost whenever it's applicable. Any tactical activity, they should ideally try to do it with technology. So that's the cost leadership in action. You also have warehouses with automation, which also helps them become efficient in many ways. So all this is aimed towards a certain way of operating their categories. On the other hand, Apple is choosing a differentiation strategy, which means here the standards are high in terms of the quality assurance. They need to have several suppliers in place globally, like Samsung, LG, Corning. Some of the big companies are part of their partnerships. And then they co-develop technology, so that helps ensure that the innovation partnership is also part of it. Now, this is a very different approach than Walmart. The procurement function, the job titles in these two companies might look the same, sound the same, but completely different universe of priorities for these companies. Right? So that's something which is what the point here is, that you need to have alignment and linkage between your strategy and your category management approach. Now, an overview of strategic sourcing. Remember that stage 2 is about strategic sourcing and how we get into that. Another example of this, we are playing the long game. So typically we talk about 3 to 5 years time horizon when we are thinking of strategic sourcing. It's not about the next quarter, what we're going to buy, or next week, whatever we need, how can we get the supplier to buy it. It's a longer term horizon, and we are not trying to save money in this quarter. Once we have that thinking, then yes, cost reduction do matter, but strategic sourcing should go beyond just cost reduction. We need to be able to optimize design of the product. Ask question like, can we work with the supplier to redesign products? And by redesigning the product, if you remember, we talked about this, that redesigning can bring down the cost over the life cycle of the product sometimes. So good design can help in bringing down the cost. Bring down the complexity. That could be another one. Complexity reduction. Can we have very standardized versions of components rather than having multiple versions of them? That can bring down the cost. So this example of Tesla and Panasonic in their Gigafactory Nevada is a prime example of how they work together. I mentioned earlier Panasonic has battery expertise and primarily coming from their partnership with Tesla. But together what they've done is Tesla's pack design capability and Panasonic's battery expertise have complemented quite well. And now they build the highest volume battery factory. So their battery production is one of the highest in the world. And that's one of the strategic sourcing advantage that they've gotten, because they work together as a team, planning for a longer term horizon. So that's essentially where every company is trying to go. A lot of companies are already there. They're moving further into stage 3, 4, 5. But when we are in stage 2 strategic sourcing, we have to go through certain steps. Right? And this is where I think category management strategy becomes a little bit more clear. How does it work? So there's a 5-stage continuous cycle. You keep doing it. So it's an iterative process. You start with step 1, which is profiling all your purchase category. Whatever you're buying, you try to understand what's the profile of this product. Now, when I say profile, it means how much we are spending on it, how much is the total consumption that we have. All those things will then profile the product that we're buying. Now, step 2 would be to analyze the market from where we are buying. So this would be the purchase product that we are purchasing. How many different suppliers do we have? Is it a complex market where there are very few suppliers and therefore we are dependent on them? Or do we have sufficient suppliers that we can rely on? So that's an analyzing supply market, step 2. Then we develop a strategy after combining these two findings. So the insights that we get from step 1 and step 2 put together is going to be the basis for our strategy development, the category strategy development. This is where we'll see later on that Rayleigh matrix will play an important role, because it helps us bring these two aspects together. Then we implement the strategy and manage sourcing performance. So on an ongoing basis, we have to ensure that once we have implemented the strategy, we are achieving the outcome that we had planned to achieve. Right? So that's sort of the goal here. It's an ongoing process. So we go back after having done this, we go back and look at other categories and profile them, analyze supply markets for them, and keep doing this ad infinitum. So we continue doing this for some time. Now, one of the things which we end up doing as part of category management strategy is risk management. Although risk management is a separate discussion we will be having, but right now we are discussing it in light of category management. How do we account for risk when we are doing category strategy, right? So this is a horror story that a lot of people are aware of, that there was a major semiconductor shortage around COVID time. And it's something which affected automotive industry quite badly. The losses by May 2021 in that industry was about $110 billion. Now, how did this happen? It was a very simple, very less expensive component, a 40-cent component, which was short in supply. It's a MOSFET chip that is needed in cars. So companies were not able to make their finished product because of the inavailability of that 40-cent component, the MOSFET chip. And that would basically imply that a 40-cent component can shut down a 40,000 vehicle. And companies are making so many of them every month that they lose all that revenue. Now, many companies had to respond rather quickly because of this issue. BMW, for example, had to create some direct semiconductor relationships around that time. They signed some of these direct supply deals for semiconductors, bypassing their traditional tiered supply chain. Otherwise, they used to get it in sort of in a multi-layer supply network. Now they're directly going into these semiconductor points. Stellantis, another company, partnered with Foxconn for these chips, and everyone was also buffering their inventory. They were having more inventories in place so that they don't end up having shortage, having backup suppliers. So what we are seeing in action is things we do as part of category management, sometimes in reactive mode, like what they're doing in this case. And sometimes we want to do it in a proactive mode. We want to be aware of potential scenarios like this that can happen. So that's aspects that we will be accounting for when we are developing a category strategy over 3 to 5 years. Are we dealing with some bottleneck items? And can we be in a situation like this where there are very few suppliers, and if that supplier goes down, we'll end up having a major supply shortage, right? So this is a consideration that companies have to keep in mind. Now, building the category outline plan requires consideration of your current requirements, but also future business requirements. So it's not just about what are we making right now, which suppliers are we dealing with right now. Clearly, that is an important point, but we also have to understand where are we going from here. It's a living document, so we need to be aware of 1 year from now, what new products probably going to be launched, how is the supply market evolving, are there new suppliers coming in the market, can we leverage them along with what we have. So those kinds of things become critical as we think about this. What's happening in the market is something which many times as sourcing manager, as an organization, you don't think about, especially in the supply market. We always think about the demand market. But now a lot of companies have started changing this. We need to keep asking which supplier do we want to work with, continue working with, which suppliers we want to change. At the sub-tier level, because supply chain we know has multiple tiers. So at the direct supplier level, we have some insights, some visibility in what they're doing. But we also want to go sub-tier level and understand who are our supplier's supplier and how are they positioned. What exactly are the kinds of risk we might be exposed to because of the supply network, a deeper level analysis of that. What are some key constraints? What are some key enablers? What's holding us back and what will help us succeed? These kinds of questions are important. And then a clear implementation plan, who does what, by when, needs to be inside the company when you're creating a category outline plan. So we create that strategy, but also have an implementation plan of how long will it take, step by step, different milestones. Because without that, we end up having a strategy on paper, but nothing is getting executed. That would mean continuing with poor decisions, missing some of the savings opportunities that you had thought there will be, and failing to deliver on the business objectives. Right? So this is why a roadmap for implementation is also important. Okay, so now that's implementation plan, but also scoping the different activities to be done in category strategy is important, because if you have a very large scope, then it becomes challenging, overwhelming to accomplish. If it's too narrow a scope, then it's not going to accomplish the objectives. It's not going to give you the outcome that you want to achieve. So it has to be the right level of scoping. And for that also, you have to go through certain steps. Right? Key stakeholders are always your important sounding boards, because the sourcing person is working with many internal customers, and these are your key stakeholders, different departments who are going to look forward to your help in getting products, engineering department, marketing, quality, whatever that might be. So you want to meet these people early in the process, very early as the step one. Because if you try to develop these strategies in isolation, then we're going to miss some of the critical needs. And then later on, so stakeholders are obviously going to be not very happy about this. They will not support your work. So being cognizant of this and involving them helps you actually get your things done rather easily. After that, you gather data, analyze data. This data could be about internal supply that we're getting, the categories that we're buying for, and then it can also be about the supply market, all that data we need. So this is where we discover fun facts. 53 different suppliers we have who are providing essentially the same product, or our plant in Michigan pays twice that of the plant located in, let's say, Indiana. So why does that happen? These are the kind of questions that we need to ask when we are doing step 2. We then compare it to industry benchmarks, where we need to understand whether we are winning or losing in our category management strategy. And sometimes the truth might hurt, but we need to know what the reality is, how far we are from the benchmarks, how well we are doing. Then we create a high-level scope document, what the boundaries are, how many different purchase categories we want to consider right now, and which one we will leave alone for now. Attain buy-in by stakeholders as well as top management, because they have to sponsor it, they have to pay for some of the changes that you're going to make. And then finalize the scope. Right? That would be the last step. You lock it down, and then this will be a charter. After the sign-in, you move on. It's official, and now you're going to develop a strategy. So that's sort of the initial steps that you have to take, organizationally speaking. We have yet to talk about frameworks that can aid the process. We will talk about that coming up in the next slide. But these are some preliminaries to have the right structure, the right implementation plan, the right scope. All those things need to be in place before we start getting into the frameworks. Okay, I'm going to pause to see if there is any question, any clarifications until here. Online teaching is always quite challenging and not that much fun, because it's ultimately, I'm relying on you responding. Okay, no questions, I move on. But we'll come to the case study, where I will definitely look forward to your inputs, your responses at that stage. So here, let's move to a very important framework which is used across organizations for category management. It's called the Kralik framework. Now, Peter Kralik was a business consultant with BCG in 1980s. He came up with this framework, and it has stood the test of time. It still is useful. Many companies use it, and it's beneficial in making those category management strategy in a best possible way. And there are other frameworks also, but we will focus more on this. Now, how does this work, and what exactly this framework tells us? Essentially, it has 2 axes, and this is where I think the case study must have helped you at least get some basic understanding of what's going on and how a framework can be helpful here. So the reason why that case study was provided was so that you have some initial insights into where we're going with regards to the framework and what typically happens in companies. So this framework has 2 axes. On the y-axis, we have the value potential of a purchase category. How much we are spending, how many units we buy, combined together tells us what's the value potential. If we make some changes to this specific purchase category, it gives us a lot more bang for the buck compared to that particular purchase category. So that understanding has to be there. So it tells us how important is that purchase category for our business. And then the x-axis is your supply market complexity. So this one is telling us how easy is it for us to negotiate in that market. And if we have a very complex market, which essentially can be in multiple ways. One could be when you have very few suppliers, it becomes complex. When the suppliers are very big companies and dominant players, that can make it complex. So anything that makes it difficult to negotiate the system for your supply requirements make the market complex. And that we need to understand, is it low or high? Right? So it's low or high value potential, low or high supply market complexity. Now, based on that, we can have a 2x2 matrix like we see here, where if the value potential is very high for the product that we are buying, and the supply market complexity is also very high, these are items that we call strategic items. Now, these are critical supplies. And these we want to manage in a certain way, which is obviously going to be different from how we will manage some other quadrants that we have here. So this kind of a product which we have will require long-term relationships. We'll talk about this. This is high value item, high complexity item. So we have to keep a foot in the supply market, have good understanding of the market, but also a good understanding of how much we are spending on it. So their long-term relationships, having top managements of your company and the supplier's company work together becomes critical. The exact opposite of that is non-critical items, which is when you have the supply market complexity, which is low, as well as value potential that is low. Now here, our approach will be quite different because we don't have enough resources to actually do long-term relationship with these companies who are involved here, or do that level of due diligence that we were doing in strategic supplies for the products that fit here. Here we will sometimes get into competitive bidding with suppliers. We will ask them to bid for contracts. We will buy at times from spot purchasing options that we might have. So we're trying to become as efficient as possible in this quadrant. The other two quadrants have one of the features which is high, the other is low. So this one is one where we have high value potential but low complexity. So these are called leverage items. And leverage items basically says that you don't have too much supply market complexity, which means you have several suppliers to deal with. You can easily negotiate your way in, but you're buying a lot of these products. You're spending a lot of money. It's a very important product that you're buying. So in this case, what you're going to do is you're going to leverage your buying potential. All the volume leverage that happens is typically in this quadrant because you want to consolidate your purchases with few suppliers and negotiate with them a good deal in this case. So that's a leverage type of an item, which obviously a lot of companies have. And then this quadrant is where the risk is very high or supply market complexity is high and value potential is low. So we are not spending too much here. It's not that critical for our business, but we have a supply market which is very complex. And we have very few suppliers who can supply this. So the example of that MOSFET chip that I was mentioning for automotive industry, it's not a very high value item, 40 cents, but it was a bottleneck item because there were not many suppliers who can supply that. So this bottleneck item requires a different approach. You cannot choose the same approach that we have talked about earlier. Here we will have to redesign our product sometimes to see if we can substitute that particular supply with something else and still get by. Because if we can do that, then we have in some way, circumvented potential problems that might come because of a supplier not being able to provide it. We could always put something else as a substitute instead of that particular supply. So that could be one where innovation becomes important. New design can be important. Standardizing could be helpful across multiple, rather than having unique items that are being used for components in our products. So that's Kreyszig matrix, sort of in a quick summary of that. Typically when we are creating this matrix and we are trying to see which items are high value items, we can always use the Pareto principle. You must have all heard of this 80-20 rule. It's called Pareto principle, where 20% of your categories will have 80% of value. And so these are the most critical categories. So there'll be 20% of your items that will fall into these two quadrants. The remaining will be in these quadrants. So that's an 80-20 rule that sometimes can be helpful just to understand how the categories will be distributed. All right, so again, I'll pause, see if you have any questions. Okay, now we're going to look for some discussion. on the case study. So I'm going to bring the case study up, which is a continuation of Kralik framework we just talked about. And I'd like to get your inputs, your reactions on what you thought about this case. So it's Meridian Electronics. We're trying to apply the Kralik's framework for this company. This company designs and manufactures industrial control systems with an annual revenue of $680 million. It sources over 4,200 unique components from 340 suppliers. So quite a few supplies we have here, quite a lot of suppliers as well. And purchased materials represent 58% of product cost. Right? So we have a substantial amount of cost of goods sold here. Currently, what the company is doing is get 3 quotations and pick the lowest price. So that's their current approach of purchases. They just want to work on price reduction. So negotiation is their way to do this. They get quotations and then ask for reduction of price. Now that is obviously stage 1 that we saw in the multi-stage category management strategy. And we want to go from stage 1 to other stages, especially stage 2, which is where we will do strategic sourcing with category management strategy as one of our approaches there. So I'm going to pull up this exhibit and see your reaction. What do you think about it? What stood out when you were looking at this? How do you plan to use such an information if you were to be given this in your category management endeavor? Anyone? I mean, we are still going to be doing this as our regular class where there's a discussion and expectation of discussion, etc. Yeah, go ahead, Mishti.
I think to just basically understand what the important products and the components are for like future steps of categorization, to understand the product
Mm-hmm.
and its category well. I think this could be used in a lot of different sections and in different ways, this information. So it is very important to know this thoroughly.
So this is one of the axes we saw in Kralik's matrix, right? This is value potential, which was our y-axis. So one point is that we have to keep this particular axis in mind whenever we're doing category strategies. So obviously, value potential assessment is an important work that has to be done. And we see this and we give a score, right? So we have a score that has been given for each of these purchase categories we have. So we have custom ASICs, a purchase category, power modules, another one, precision sensors. They're buying all these different types of products. For all of them, they've given a value score here. But how did we get to that score, right? For example, Y5 here, Y4.5 here. Like, how do we get to these numbers? Anyone else? Anyone other than Mishti who can now get into the discussion?
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question again? Just one more time.
Yeah, so this exhibit, we are just exploring this. We saw this exhibit. We see that there's a final value score given to each purchase category. We're just trying to explore why these numbers, how did these numbers
Yeah.
come about? What do you think must have happened in the back end to create such a table within an organization? Because somebody must have done this assessment in the company, right? There are people who must have been sitting together and doing something like this.
I guess, yeah, I guess when I look at it, and if you look at going from the lower scores kind of going up, it kind of seems like the scores are based on, I don't want to use a circular definition and say like the most valuable, but I guess what's used the most and what impacts the company the most, as well as, you know, when your customer looks at you as a company, how does that specific item contribute to their perception of you?
Okay. So it could be one way of thinking. Yeah. Go ahead, Mishti.
I think also this table clearly tells why competitive bidding wouldn't work, and it does not work because of the way that the categories are distributed. And about the value score, I think what they did was they like took an average of the highest score, like gave of the scores, and it is I think yeah, basically that's they
Some
cannot be
process they must
compared.
have followed. Maybe
Yeah.
average, maybe
Yeah.
some other approach.
I
I mean,
mean,
clearly some of them are quite straightforward, right? Office supplies, giving a value of 1. It has the lowest annual spend. It also has the lowest score in all the metrics. So this is rather straightforward. So some are straightforward, but some are not. For instance, this has been given a 5, highest possible value score. This has been given a 5, highest possible value score, although the spend is only 18.2, 10 million less than that. And this one, which has quite a high annual spend, 34 million, 35 million, has been given a value score of 4. Right? So it's not just the annual spend that can be the criteria, there has to be a multidimensional approach. And the reason why these two ended up getting higher scores compared to that 34.8 is because we are including innovation potential as a very important component for this company, because that is valuable for this business. So innovation potential, customer perception is valuable for this company. So sometimes we have to consider multiple dimensions to understand what value really means. It cannot be just the dollar amount that you're spending. Now, if these things are involved, then we need also cross-functional team. So in the back end, we need to have engineering team, quality management, others also being part of this to assess each category, how much value do they give for this, right? So that's what the point here is.
yeah. What's it called? Also, to build off of what Mishki said about long-term agreements, it seemed like there was some sort of relationship for the custom ASICs, right? So it seemed like there was some sort of relationship happening there, but because the company was, but because Meridian was going from one supplier to the next, and it was just shifting every single year, even though there was a relationship, like for example in the case study it said that TSS, they just didn't want to go and give them any information, because if while they do have the relationship, if they're jumping from one company to another to find their products every single year, then they just don't want to potentially have information get leaked out.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are aspects like that, but remember one thing: whatever happens about relationships with suppliers and all those things related to suppliers belong to the second quadrant, which is the supply market complexity. We have yet to come to that. Actually, we have only talking about value potential, which is our y-axis. So that's a good point, but I want to go back to just show you that we are now only focusing on the y-axis
Okay.
and trying to understand how do you even define value potential, because it's an important variable in our Krelix matrix. Unless we define this correctly, we will not be able to create this. But yes, supplier relationship is an important one too, and that is a point we have to also think about. So I think the core idea here is always think of multiple dimensions, involve cross-functional team to determine what the value score is. You could be using 80-20 rule in the end potentially, because there are only 20% of these items that will be high potential items. As you can see, very few have 5, and others don't have 5. So that's an important understanding that we need to have. Now this is where we get to the x-axis, the second exhibit. Now we are not looking at the y-axis, we are not looking at the value potential, but we are focusing on what's the supply market complexity for these items. So here comes the importance of suppliers, what kind of relationships we have, how many do we have there. So what do we see here? again, complexity scores can range quite a bit, right? So the highest complexity seems to be for the custom ASICs chips here. There are four different dimensions that we see. Just like in value potential, we had certain dimensions, we have 4 of them. Now we'll see later that these 4 dimensions are borrowed from Porter's forces. I mean, if you have studied strategy, you must have studied Porter's forces, right? So you have differentiation and cost leadership, but you have different forces that play a role in how companies create their strategy. It could be competitive forces, it could be barriers to entry, it could be substitutability. All these things are part of that. But what we do in sourcing is we borrow from that and adapt that in our context, in sourcing context, how it can be used. So that supply market complexity is now defined using the level of competition. When we say level of competition, what are we saying here? What competition is it? Who is competing? I'm looking for others also to contribute. Okay, so I know that people have not switched on the video other than 2 of you, but I do want everybody to be involved in this discussion. It's just unfortunate that we cannot meet in class, but we want to keep it similar to what we do in class.
I'll just hazard a guess. I'm assuming it's like the competition between buyers for the certain like item in the category. Like I guess if it's a level 4 or the score is 4, that means a lot of people are buying for this specific item.
Okay.
So it's like very just a busy buyer market for this specific
So
ASIC.
one way to think of this is that the competition level is how many buyers are there, how many buyers are competing for the suppliers. Okay, that could be one way to think about this.
So I wanted to also build on that a little bit. It's not only how many buyers there are, but also your company's own position within the market. For example, an Apple is always going to have sort of that extra, not necessarily leverage, but in terms of competition, there's less competition because a supplier will be seeing it as I'm doing business with Apple. There's a little bit more of a almost an appeal to that. Whilst, for example, a smaller company, for example, in this case of the ASICs, if they're a smaller company, they might not be as well known, they might have less leverage, so the competition is higher because they're not as big of a player.
Okay, but would that not fall under buyer's power? In some way, Apple, when they have that brand equity, isn't that brand equity in some form a power for the buyer to be able to negotiate with suppliers the way they want?
Yeah, it also. So I guess I hadn't even noticed that. That's
Yeah,
on me.
but then competition has to be between multiple people involved, or multiple companies. One way to think about this is that multiple buyers are competing. Apple is competing, and Samsung is also there. Everybody wants to buy from this one supplier, which makes the competition level high. So that could be one way to view it. But there could be another way to view it, and that would be.
Sorry, Professor, I have a follow-up question. So these categories, for example, competition level, barriers to entry, are those arbitrary based off each company's needs, or is those?
No, these are standard. These
almost
are standard.
Okay.
These are something which we always use to assess supply market complexity,
Okay.
borrowing from Porter's forces. Yeah. So one could be buyer's competition level. What else? Okay. Yeah.
I think it talks about how many capable suppliers exist and how intense competition is there in terms of suppliers, like how easily can you get a supplier for this particular category?
So the other way to think of it is suppliers competition, right? So one is the buyer's competition for the supplier. The other is how many suppliers are there. If the suppliers are competing with each other quite intensively, it actually helps you as a buyer, because these suppliers will want to reduce their price, want to get your business. So from a sourcing perspective, this competition level is actually suppliers competition. How many suppliers are there, and if there are too many of them, do they compete fiercely with each other? And there are many markets like this where there could be several suppliers competing very fiercely with others, and then other markets where there could be a monopoly, only one supplier from whom we can buy, which obviously makes that supplier quite powerful also, but also there's not too much of competition. Or it could be a duopoly. There are two major suppliers you can buy from, which also is not very conducive for the buyer, because you don't have too many players to compete against, make them compete against each other. So they can even collude with each other sometimes, the two oligopoly markets here. So competition is about suppliers competing with each other, and it's a very important variable for us to understand supply market complexity. The other one is barriers to entry. What comes in your mind when you think about barriers to entry and its relationship with supply market complexity, the way it defines supply market complexity? What would that mean? Who is entering and whose barriers to entry?
I think it's like the barrier to entry regarding like buying the part, like how competitive already is that like market, and how easy is it to contact suppliers and get that part.
So you're saying barriers to actually approach a supplier is what this is capturing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one way to think about this. I mean, right now we have yet to talk a lot about it, but I just wanted to see this as in when you see this as a first instance, what comes in your mind. So one could be thought of as barriers to reach to this suppliers. But we know that today, I think with internet and information availability, reaching suppliers is not really that difficult. We have a lot of information available. So that's not the challenge that typically ends up here. So I want to bring back your attention to this title. It's supply market complexity, right? So when we say entry, we are really talking about entry into the market. Some company entering into the market. How easy is it for a competitor or any company to enter into the supply market and start offering services? When we think about certain products, it's relatively easy. Creating an e-commerce retail store or starting a restaurant. There is some expense, but it's nowhere comparable to, let's say, starting a big telecom service company. Because to create a telecom service company, you have to set up satellites, you have to invest in all those architecture and everything else. So there are certain types of markets, supply markets, where suppliers can easily enter that market because it's the barrier is pretty low. You don't have that much of a technology barrier, you don't have too much of financial barrier, so companies can launch and get into that. So what we are looking at here is what's the barrier of entry in a supply market. If the barriers are high, is it good for us as a buyer or is it bad for us as a buyer? Because everything is viewed from the perspective of a buyer. We are in sourcing class, which means that everything has to be viewed from the buyer's perspective, right? We are buyers, we're buying products. So if there is a barrier to entry in the supply market, is it a good thing or a bad thing for us as a buyer? There is too high a barrier in the supply market for entry. Would it help us or will it hurt us? Yeah.
I think it could hurt us because there is less flexibility in pricing and negotiation in a way that the prices tend to be more competitive. You have less options.
But would this reduce the options though? Let's think again. If the barriers to entry is high, what would happen? There will not be too many suppliers. A new supplier will find it very difficult to enter. We're not trying to reach a restaurant, or we're not trying to reach a e-commerce setup. We're trying to reach, let's say, a telecom provider. And we only have one or two that we can work with. We don't have big numbers. So when barriers to entry are high, not many suppliers can be in that market, which reduces our ability to deal with many suppliers. And hence, we don't have the ability to negotiate. So in a way, what you said is right. But the logic is that you don't have too many suppliers who can enter, and we don't have the ability to leverage that option of increasing so in some way these two are highly connected. When you have more barriers to entry, you'll have lesser competition. Whoever is already there in that market would have already taken much of the market space and the advantage in that market. So these are related issues, but we consider them as two separate things because they do capture, one is more of a static, currently what's going on with competition, whereas barriers to entry is future oriented. What can be possible? Can there be new suppliers who can enter? Can we create new suppliers? Sometimes buyers can actually nudge some suppliers to enter into certain markets, and Toyota does all the time. They have so many suppliers that sometimes they say, okay, why don't you get into this particular market where we need some supplies and we don't have too many suppliers, and we can help you in several ways. That's only possible when the barriers to entry is not too much. So that's a critical point. I mean, if you think of AI revolution today, Apple has decided to work with Google Gemini for their AI model, right? For their GPT model. They are not going to create their own model. Apple is not planning to create their own model. So in some way, Google, who actually was a competitor to Apple, is now Apple's supplier of this GPT model. Now, why is it that Apple did not get into this, or what is the challenge that Apple must have faced here? The challenge here is that the barriers to entry is very high. Creating a GPT model today with trillions and trillions of these different neurons that has to be created, very expensive, as we already know how much money OpenAI has already spent on it, how much Gemini has already spent on it. So it's a losing proposition to spend that kind of money for many companies. So you end up cornering much of the market by doing this. So this is an example of current situation that we see in AI sphere, because AI has so many different layers. One of the layers is the model layer, and model layer is becoming concentrated in some way. Barriers to entry is becoming more and more difficult. So you cannot see too many suppliers in this market anymore. There will be smaller models, but not the big ones. So that's the second variable. The third variable is substitutes. Are there substitutes that are available for the product that we want to buy? Now, if substitutes are available, it's actually good for us, right? I mean, we are now having more options. We only used to buy that MOSFET chip, which is the only way our automobile works in the past. Let's say we created a design where that particular MOSFET chip can be replaced with something else, substituted by something else. Then we have more leverage. We have ability to choose something else. So supply market complexity has certainly come down. Right? So this is something which brings down, substitutes available will bring down the complexity. It's good for the buyer if you have more substitutes. So that's the supply market complexity variable, where we know having substitutes is good for us, not having substitutes is not good for us. And the last one is buyer power. It's kind of straightforward. You have the power, and that was already mentioned earlier, example of Apple. When you have some form of power, whether it's because you're a large organization, you have a lot of purchases, or because you have innovation abilities, you have brand equity, whatever the reason might be, you could have some advantage. So more buyer power means less complexity in the market for you, right? So that's something which then can help us capture the complexity score for different products that we are buying here. Now, those two quadrants, those two axes, value potential and supply market complexity, define the entire value, the entire Kreyszig matrix. And once we have defined those two, we can determine which items will go into strategic, which purchases will go into leverage, which one will go into bottleneck, and which one will go into routine. Right? This is straightforward now because we already have given scores to them with an understanding of what value potential means and what supply market complexity means. Now we can look at those numbers and see if both are high. If both value potential is high and supply market complexity is high, those purchase categories should fit into the strategic items set. Right? So the custom ASICs and all these are the examples of that. And a combined spend of $69.2 million. Currently, the company is using competitive bidding. Right? So that's a different question to ask whether that's the right thing or not. But at least we know what kind of purchase categories fit into strategic items. Then we have certain items where we have high value potential. So value potential score is high, but our supply market complexity is low. So if you go back and look at those two worksheets, we'll see for PCB assemblies and enclosures, our value potential scores are high, but our supply market complexity scores are low. So that's a different kind of product. It's a leverage type of a product. We have about $49 million in this company that belong to that. Even those suppliers deal with this company through competitive bidding. Again, a question to ask whether that's the right strategy or not. Bottleneck, special connectors that they have, their specialty connectors, about 3.8 million. So this is ones where we have very high supply market complexity, but low value potential. Scores will be low. So it's just $3.8 million type of items that we have here. Right now, we don't have too much option to get competitive bidding because by definition, this is a high complexity market. We don't have too many suppliers who can compete with each other. So here we have only a single source, and we need to think about whether we are okay with keeping that single source or we need to do something about it. Create new suppliers in this market. And then routine items, $33.8 million, standard connectors, passives, cables, etc. So that's here. So now what should we do about the strategy? Clearly, competitive bidding in strategic items, we already talked about that in the discussion of Prelix Matrix, does not make sense, right? You have some suppliers who are providing us high value items, highly complex market. How can we get this competitive bidding be our source of strength? On the other hand, for routine items, perhaps that's the right strategy. We want to ensure that we get the lowest possible price, make it efficient, as efficient as possible. With these two, I'd like to see what you think. What do we do with leverage items? Instead of competitive bidding, what would you suggest? If you have high value and low complexity, you have too many suppliers, but you're spending a lot of money on these. You have also other value potential categories, innovation potential, and so many other things we looked at that can define value. So this is a leverage item. 49 million is a big number. We could always ask all these suppliers to compete against each other and get the best price. That's one way to do it. But is that the best strategy here? Anyone other than whoever has spoken? Only two of you have spoken so far. Or three of them, but I can't see more others. All right, any more inputs? What is it that we can do in leverage category that can help us? For the company, what is it that is most important here to gain the most benefit in category management strategy? Not seeing any discussion going on today. Yeah, go ahead, Misty.
I think the leverage category really helps us understand where the price really matters and where switching is actually feasible.
But here also we're buying so much, we have got a lot of value here. We would like to also consolidate, right? We want to not buy from many suppliers. We want to consolidate by design. Even though we have options of multiple suppliers, we would rather want to consolidate our supplies with one or two. And the reason why we want to do this is because now we can ask for volume discounts. $49 million we're buying from one of you or two of you. We can ask for volume discount. We can ask for better innovation inputs from them. That's the kind of things we can do. Isaac?
Yeah, I was gonna say by reducing our suppliers, we can also maybe look into specialty items, into custom parts. Assuming that they're able to go and take on a bigger workload. That is something that we could ask of them due to the better relationship that we would have.
Yeah. So we could potentially ask them to think about creating substitutes for us if they can have the innovation abilities. So that's an option that we can do with either mostly strategic type of ones, but leverage also sometimes. For bottleneck, I mean, clearly single source is a very dangerous situation like the MOSFET chips example that we talked about. So we do want to create either a new design which allows for substitutes of the product or develop new suppliers, have more suppliers as backups. So we have to have some buffer here That's the key. Okay, so that's sort of our exhibit just to capture different types of quadrants. So this is sort of what we have already talked about, what the strategy should be at a broad level. Collaboration and partnership for strategic, volume concentration for leverage, risk management, as I mentioned, by having dual sourcing or creating a new type of design for bottleneck, and efficiency and automation for routine by making sure we can use reverse auctions, for example. But there are several tactics we can have to achieve it. Long-term agreements, we can have longer-term contracts here, get into joint development programs like the example of Panasonic and Toyota that we saw. So those are examples of strategic relationship development. Here we consolidate suppliers, make that multi-year contract and get the discounts. That's the kind of things we can do here. And that's something which we will still be using competitive bidding, but after having narrowed down the number of suppliers. We don't want to give it to multiple suppliers by asking them to bid. Each of them can bring down the price, but that's not what we want. We want to give them higher percentage of this business and ask for some discount. And developing backup suppliers would be our tactic here, increasing safety stocks, some substitutes that we can create, whereas routine will be e-procurement systems, reverse auctions, supplier, vendor managed inventories, etc. So we have different tactics depending on the type of item we have. Now for custom ASIC, they had some more micro level assessment. This exhibit basically illustrates why some strategic items require partnership rather than bidding. Only 3 capable suppliers we have for this strategic item. And then on top of it, the company currently has competitive bidding with all 3 of them. So clearly this product which belongs to strategic item with 3 suppliers and be going with a competitive bidding approach does not make sense. We do have sort of an illusion of choice, but in reality that is not being utilized in the right way. With 3 suppliers we think that there is choice, but actually that is not being manifested in terms of how it's done. There's an 18 to 24 months switching time. When we say switching time, basically it means switching from one supplier to the other supplier. And it's not easy to just go and ask another supplier and say, start delivering us supplies from tomorrow, because that supplier has to build the required credentials, the infrastructure capability. So that 18 to 12 months, 24 months is not a good sign. Clearly that can create risk scenarios also in the future. So that's another factor that we need to account for. And on top of it, there's a cost involved in switching, 4.2 million. So this makes the risk very prominent in this particular sector, and hence we need to think about this. And the supplier obviously has said something about how they quote, that they conservatively quote because of the way currently the company is managing this particular supply. But ideally what you really want is a joint development of IPs, shared IP products for products, and that's what is going to lead to an outcome which is beneficial. So this was a proposal, some partnerships state currently, and what are the ways in which we can get some improvements. So just highlights the kinds of things that typically happen in strategic supplies between a buyer and supplier. So the reason why this was included in the case was to emphasize what kind of things typically happen between strategic partners: investments, joint developments, favorable financing by the supplier to the buyer, joint IP, sometimes intellectual property is jointly owned by 2 parties. Both parties have top management level engagement, quarterly business reviews. Your engineers are embedded in their company, their engineers are embedded in your company. So you will actually send your engineers to the plant of your supplier, and supplier may send their engineers to your plant. By doing so, you're cross-learning between the 2 companies. So there are things that we could do, and each of them have a value impact, because ultimately that's the goal of strategic items. So it elaborates on that idea of what we can do. So here, this particular exhibit is powerful in demonstrating the bottleneck risk that we can have for certain items. In bottleneck items, we only have $3.8 million of annual spend. We don't spend too much. Just like that MOSFET chip, which was only 40 cents, but it can bring down $40,000 worth of car production. Here also, we don't spend too much. So when we don't spend too much, you start perceiving it as low importance, a small category. You don't have to think too much about it. If you think of COVID, many of the personal protection equipment, PPEs, that got in short supply because for several of these we started giving less importance to this. They were not too expensive, and we never had like a set of suppliers that can take up the burden if needed. So sometimes it could be a function of time and cost. It's not there. So this spend cannot be the only reason we can think of it. We need to look at it from the number of qualified suppliers. Do we have that? Do we have backup supplier qualification? Even if they are not supplying to us, do we have qualified suppliers? Because that's a different thing. Having two suppliers simultaneously supplying us, that's one way of managing your sourcing. The other one is buy from one, but have more qualified suppliers in the backup who can pick up the load if needed. That's a new way of thinking for many companies. They have started creating that backups here. So total crisis cost, if we don't manage it correctly, can go as high as 3.54. So even though the item spend is only 3.8 million, but if crisis comes in, it can create a total crisis cost of 3.54. And that's something which we want to avoid. And it can be avoided through some proactive management, about $200,000 if spent qualifying backup suppliers. It can actually help us achieve that. So that's something which this case emphasizes, and this way we can actually quantify how much can we benefit. This particular figure is quantifying the opportunity cost of over managing routine items. When we have routine items and we are over managing it with procurement hours spent on them, almost 2,560 hours spent on routine items. So somebody is sending purchase orders, receiving also the quotations from suppliers, going over it. So a lot of time is being spent. We saw this in another example case that we had. This is lost opportunity because 1.3 full-time equivalent time is spent in just managing routine items, which ideally you want to automate, make it efficient. Right? So that's sort of the point here for this particular slide. So this would be sort of our overall strategic plan, which again, everything is there in the case. I just wanted to flesh it out a little bit more. So this one does not have a pressing problem. It just illustrates different things, but some of them you may not have gone deeper into what those quadrants mean, what those columns mean, which is what we wanted to do in the discussion. But current issue with strategic is that we are using transactional approach. We need to move to partnership agreements. We saw what exactly that partnership looks like. Leverage, current issue is its fragmented supply base. We are getting competitive bidding, but we are not really buying from few suppliers. By consolidation, the goal should be to consolidate to 3 or 4 suppliers and get volume leverage, get those discounts. For bottleneck, we don't have any backup suppliers, no qualified backup suppliers because everything has been ignored so far, assuming that it's only $3.8 million of spend. So what we need is qualify some alternatives, keep some safety stock, some risk monitoring. All this has some potential benefits that has been highlighted here. And routine items, it's overmanaged. Too many manual activities are going on here. We need to automate that, and we can bring down the transaction cost by 60%. So this is typically the approach that we take in category management plan that we have to create, right? So that's what this is trying to highlight. Now, when we actually go about creating Krelix matrix, we already saw in this case that they had given scores for value potential. They had given score for market complexity. There are some templates that we can actually use also, right? So for example, this is one template that we can use. Every purchase category that we have, we can run it through this template. We can look at the prices, cost trend, volume specification, how exactly those are moving for that particular purchase category. So if you're buying semiconductors, if you're buying structural items, whatever it might be, we collect the prices and cost trends. So we can see what the cost impact might be for that item. Is it high or low, right? So that's what we can put a score to that. We can analyze the product performance in terms of customer perception, quality, etc., how important that is, weak versus strong. So for every item, using cross-functional team, because it cannot be done by just the sourcing person, you have to involve other team members, other functions. All of you can be giving a rating for each purchase category on these 4 parameters. Now for cost impact, perhaps the sourcing person is the best person to give that value. But for product performance, maybe it is the engineering team, maybe it is the marketing team, customer perception, clearly the marketing and sales team know better. So for every purchase category, they can give a score. 0 is weak and 5 is strong. It just tells us the value potential. So what we can do is average the scores that we have received for each purchase category by all the different functional areas. So engineering believes that category A that we buy has very high technology component. Others may not, but we give a little more weight to the engineering team's response for innovation, less for others. In the end, we create a final score. And then out of these final scores, we take the maximum value potential score. So that would become the value potential for one of the purchase categories that we want to buy. So that is what we do with the creation of the value potential, understanding the value potential. And we typically want to have this, what we call a SMART category goal, which is specific. For every category, there should be a specific goal. It should be measurable. It should be achievable. It should be relevant and time bound. So that category management plan that we saw in the case study, it should be SMART, right? So very specific, as we saw. There was a clear idea of what exactly we're going to do, and everything has been measured, what the outcome will be, what the benefits are going to be. Achievable, because we know consolidation can help in leverage items and all that. Relevant because of the type of purchases, and it should be time bound. So what we create is a goal, like for every component, what are we going to do, and what are the outcomes we're going to get because of that, something we just saw. So that was an example of the way it eventually looks like. Now coming to market complexity, because not all suppliers in the market are created equal, we need to understand what exactly the supply market looks like. So let's take an example here for a purchase of steel castings. A company buys steel castings, and these steel castings can come in multiple variants. Small precision is one type of steel, large precision is another type of steel, large rough is third type of steel. So they buy different types of steel, and then within small precision, let's say they buy high volume and low volume type of purchases. Right? So this is an example that we have. Now we want to map the supply market across suppliers who are supplying all these different types of products. How do we do this for each of these products? So let's say large precision casting, we want to see how many suppliers are there, where are they located, what exactly is the concentration levels in that industry, are there mergers happening, are suppliers buying each other, who are the market leaders, what are their market shares, how much capacity is being utilized by these companies. So this is almost thinking of yourself as being part of that supply market and understanding everything about that market, macroeconomically speaking. So this is what a good sourcing person would do as part of reading the supply market, understanding what's going on in that particular product. And Porter's 5 forces play a very useful role. I mean, we don't use 5 forces because the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers get consolidated into one, right? In our case, because we are only interested in bargaining power, relative bargaining power of the buyer. So it automatically becomes 4 different forces in the sourcing context. But we do look at threat of new entrants, which is the barriers to entry. We look at substitutes. Can we have substitutes or not? We saw that in the case study. We look at competitive rivalry between suppliers, a very important way to understand whether the supply market is highly complex or not. And then relative power of the buyer compared to the supplier. So these forces then help us understand the supply market complexity, like we saw in that case study. So the case study is a nice way to sort of capture that idea, which is what you see here. We just have the supplier versus buyer power as against having both of them separately. So it ends up becoming 4, but it's adapted for procurement now. Right. So now each of them, we saw why all of them can be relevant. Rivalry can help us have multiple suppliers and they can compete with each other, give us a better deal. Buyer's power can be influential. Apple's example we took its brand image can help us get better deal, and so on and so forth, right? So bargaining power can be affected by all these different things that we have there, and that's something which companies have to consider when they are planning for their purchases. How exactly their overall supply network looks like and what is their situation within that in terms of the bargaining power. Now, similar to the template that we used for value potential, where we looked at cost impact, innovation, product performance, and customer perception, for example, and those don't have to be the only four. You can choose whatever you want. Some people might add, let's say, sustainability as one of the dimensions. So value potential can be using different types of things which matter to the company, depending on which industry you are in. Similar to that, in the case of supply market complexity, we can evaluate it systematically by asking these questions. Rivalry within the industry, for that supply market, how much it is. I'm buying this large precision steel casting. How many suppliers are there? Do they have 15 suppliers or just 2? So these are the questions: number of capable suppliers, rate of industry growth, level of product differentiation in that industry. I'm asking these questions for that industry, for that product, and then giving a score, right? So a low value here is a strong rivalry. High value here is a weak rivalry. So in some way, low value helps the buyer because strong rivalry will help us as a buyer. When they are having too much rivalry, they will compete against each other and give us a better price. And if it's a weak rivalry, it will help the supplier because the supplier has monopoly. So is the case with everything else. Barriers to entry, if there's weak barriers to entry, new suppliers can enter the market, helps us as buyers. So we can examine this by looking at what is the capital requirement. So if it's a telecom company, very high capital requirement. If it's to create a new GPT model, very high capital requirement. But if it's about a new sort of retail outlet that we want, perhaps not as capital intensive. Also regulatory restrictions, proprietary technology. There are other ways in which barriers to entry can manifest. So we need to know that. Likewise, substitution, easy substitution, good for us. Harsh substitution, good for the supplier. Right? Because if we can easily substitute, we can work with something else as a supply component. And finally, bargaining power. Low value supports the buyer, higher value supports the supplier. So we are now looking at giving some scores, and then in this case we don't take the maximum value, unlike what we saw in the value potential template, where what we do was we gave some value for each of these. I'm going back there and just showing you. Notice that I gave the value here and chose the maximum among these as my value potential, because that defines my value potential for that category, which is the maximum out of them. So if cost impact happens to the maximum, I'll take that value and disregard the other ones. But for supply market complexity, I'm not taking maximum, I'm taking average. Any thoughts why average makes sense here, but not so in there? Why average is a better way to think about supply market complexity scores that we got here, and instead of taking maximum, we just took an average. What might be some reason here? Just some reflection on that. The reason why this makes sense is that it's possible that in some of these metrics, the buyer is good, better off, they have a better strength. In some other metrics, supplier has a better condition, right? So for example, there is high rivalry within the industry, which helps us, but there is barriers to entry also. It's possible. Or we have a lot of substitutions that is available. So in some case, it actually helps the supplier. In some case, it helps the buyer. What we want is, on average, is it a complex market or not a complex market? Right? We want to know, on average, where does it tilt, which way it is going. So that's why in this case, we try to look at it as an average. Whereas in the case of value potential, we want to know that specific factor which contributes the most in defining the value for the item. And we want to take that into consideration. It could be cost, it could be innovation, it could be product performance, whatever the case might be. So that's sort of the underlying reason behind it. So now we have understanding of Kreyszig matrix. We understand how we can capture value potential, how we can capture supply market complexity. two templates we looked at which can help us do this. Now, beyond Krelix matrix, there are some generic strategies, right? These are strategies that we should be using regardless of any category management strategy. We don't have to categorize these products into strategic versus routine to do this. So for example, volume leveraging, if we do have the advantage of that, we should always look for volume leveraging. It's a given. It doesn't need any debate for that. We should not be sort of cluttering ourselves with so many different suppliers that we lose all that volume leverage. So spend analysis that you will do in spend data, one of the things that you're looking at is, can we use some of these generic strategies directly without even doing any category management, that we are buying from 5 different suppliers, whereas ideally we should be buying from 2 of them, and then reduce our cost. Best price strategy, which is, we saw some examples where multiple divisions of the company are buying from different suppliers and the price variance is very high. We don't want that, right? We want to have the best possible price from whichever supplier it is. And that is a given, that if we have high price variance, we want to avoid that. From the same supplier, if you're getting different prices, that's even worse, because ideally that supplier should give us the best price for the entire organization, not for individual departments. Having collaborative relationship, again, a requirement in general for most of the things we do. And then finally, process improvement, wherever we can reduce the cost in our processes or in conjunction with the supplier in their processes, it can bring down the cost, which can help us get a better value, right? So that's another thing, which is a generic strategy. And rationalizing SKUs, not having too many different products that we buy, but reduce the number of items. In the surgery example or healthcare example, I talked about this, that having 5 different colors of kneecaps, choose one color, which still does the job. We are standardizing it instead of having too many of them, because too many SKUs increase inventories, add cost for purchases, and having supplier management and all those things. So when we standardize it, it actually reduces the cost. So these are generic strategies, and always should be thinking about them irrespective of any category management strategy. But having learned Krelix matrix, we should also create strategies over and above what we just learned in the previous slide. That is category specific strategies. So these are specific to the type of category. So if it's a strategic item, we talked about this, long-term relationships, collaboration with that supplier, joint innovation, those kinds of things we have to do. If it's a non-critical items, let's standardize the product, create efficiency in the process, make it automated if possible, reduce the amount of manual labor hours being spent on it, and open up the time for other things to be done. If it's a leverage item, let's exploit our full purchasing power by negotiating better price, by consolidating the number of suppliers and giving them larger volume, longer term contracts. So that way we can get a better price for it, right? That's the strategy here. And then bottleneck items, because we don't have control on suppliers, there are few of them. We always want to create some qualified backups. We want to see if we can redesign the product so that the components can be substituted with something else, which does the job as well as what we are buying from the supplier. So those are things that become strategic. So these are category strategies that are specific to the type of item we are buying. And this has to be also considered along with the generic strategies that we saw in the previous slide. So in aggregate, what we now have are 4 specific strategies and then few generic strategies. Right? So we are combining both of them. So if we are a good sourcing person, then we would first think about generic strategies, ensure that those are in place. Then we try to understand what kind of a category it is, and then design strategic approaches for it. What exactly we should be doing for each of these items. That was what the case was emphasizing also. You're familiar with VMI, vendor managed inventory, which is basically your supplier is going to be managing inventories that they are sending to us. So any replenishment that is needed, the supplier takes that into account. Right? You don't have to send replenishment orders. They keep track of how the inventory is getting consumed and they keep replenishing it as and when needed. So this way you're reducing the amount of oversight or purchasing hours that you're spending on it and letting the supplier do this themselves. So there are some practices which are more of how you manage that supply. Now, this is an example of how that supply market complexity template that we just talked about actually is enacted. So this is an example of a telecom service which is to be procured by a government agency. A government agency is trying to determine from whom we should buy this telecom service. So what they do is they do the value potential analysis, looking at cost and other things. But then they also look at the supply market complexity. And this is the score that they give for each of these different metrics. So rivalry within the industry, they gave a score of close to 1. And that's because there are 4 major national providers. And these 4 providers have almost 90% of the market share. So it's highly concentrated with these 4 players, right? So there's a there is a strong rivalry between these players. And I mentioned earlier, lower value is better for the buyer. Low value here is better for the buyer. It actually means there's a strong rivalry. So strong is here and weak is here. For barriers to entry, actually there's more things here. There is also regional players besides these 4 who are creating price competition. So even better situation for the buyer. The second one is barriers to entry. The barriers to entry will be very high in this case because it's a nationwide service, a lot of capital investment needed in this business. So it's not easy for anybody to enter this market. So they gave a higher score of 4 for this particular category, right? So 1 here, 4 here. As we can see, some of these are favoring the buyer, some of this is favoring the supplier. For substitution, the government agency realizes that Wi-Fi with laptops can substitute some of this data usage that we have to use here. Available substitutes are limited for voice services, but we do have some options. So it's right in the middle, about 3, that score that they gave here for this one. And then bargaining power, as a government agency, they do have a large number of users who will be needing voice and data usage. So it's an attractive volume for the supplier. So they will be interested in the business with the buyer. And many of the users are located in the US cellular service area. So that's also going to be sort of helping increase the bargaining power. So they have given a 2, which is actually more of the buyer having the bargaining power compared to the supplier. So these 4 scores, then we take an average, and that's sort of the market complexity for this particular item. So this is how you actually enact this template when you have to do it for a given scenario. Okay, so future of category strategy, I mean, we will be thinking of it more in terms of value creation focus, not just, price reduction like we talked about earlier, but also network focus, looking at multiple tiers rather than just looking at our first tier supplier, who's our second tier supplier, third tier supplier. Are there risk factors there? Is there a bottleneck there? Can we leverage purchases at that level of analysis? Can we create strategic partners at that level? So sometimes we have to go few levels inside the network and then do these analysis at that stage. So that's sort of where it's going in terms of future. Some proactive market influence, supply market. When I say market influence, we want to do some proactive things in the market, like creating a new supply base by encouraging new suppliers to get in, helping them have that technology abilities, joint IPs, etc. Cross-category synergies, and then enlarging the pie together. So with the supplier, you want to create joint ventures like Toyota, Panasonic example that we saw. So that's how it's evolving when we reach stage 4 and 5. So I think this is almost the last slide here. The enablers for success in category strategy will be cross-functional teams like we saw earlier, top management involvement, executive involvement that we see at the bottom, high quality analytics, which was the foundation, some contracting frameworks that we will be using long-term or short-term, having a total cost of ownership type of mentality, and doing the right research of the supply market, being able to know what is going on in that market. We need to use secondary data sometimes to see what that is, what's going on in that market. So with that, I think this is where I give you the key takeaways. It creates value that did not exist before. If done well, there's a lot of value that we can gain, as we saw in the case study. Many companies have yet to reap those benefits. The Krelix matrix can be beneficial here in terms of matching the strategies to the type of the product we have. So characteristics of the purchase category and what strategy we should adapt. Alignment matters. So different companies should decide a category management strategy based on what their overall strategy is. Is it a cost leadership? Is it differentiation? Whatever that is. And finally, the future is collaborative ecosystem partnerships, companies jointly going together and creating new markets. So that's where companies should also try to find advantages by working with suppliers. With that, I think I conclude, but I can take any questions, clarifications that you might have with what we talked about today. Basically, that covers our category management strategy, and we are moving into Unit 2 after this in spend analysis and cost management.
I have a question, Professor. Especially when talking about like the future of category strategy. You mentioned that there was, building supply networks into tier 2, 3, and et cetera, suppliers. So I guess my question is, usually wouldn't the suppliers want to have, like the tier 1 suppliers want to have some reservations, because unless you're the only customer they have, would they want to reveal that information to you about who their tier 2s are? And then the tier 2s themselves, how would they feel about revealing information to, let's run with the case of Apple. Apple goes to one of their suppliers, asks, who are your suppliers? Would that, specific supplier want to say that information? What incentive would there be for them to give that information to Apple?
So in today's world, actually, it's absolutely critical to get that information. In fact, there should be no reservation from any of the supply chain partners to reveal the information of who they are buying from, right? So, I mean, if let's say I'm Apple, I'm buying products from Samsung or Nvidia or whatever, or Intel, let's say, and Intel is buying from some other suppliers. As Apple, I have all the rights to understand the supply network, because I would want to make sure that I am not exposed to risk. Now, what is it that the supplier loses by doing this? The supplier might think that, well, Apple might go and create a relationship with that second tier supplier, and then and get an arrangement that will work in favor of Apple, but not in favor of Intel or whoever else. But this is where I think a good communication in terms of what the intent of that action is going to be playing a role. Because if you don't have visibility of a second tier and third tier supplier, you're putting yourself in trouble and your direct supplier into trouble, and then eventually the second and third tier supplier, which is what we saw with many of the disruptions. So today, I think suppliers don't necessarily have reservations of informing who the network partners are, but what they would expect is that when a company like Apple is going and negotiating with the second tier supplier in terms of how different things are going to be happening, ideally what they want to do is they want to work with their first tier suppliers and jointly go and create that arrangement. Oftentimes Apple's relationship with its first tier supplier is going to be a lot more stronger than their second tier supplier and third tier supplier. Right? So if they're circumventing that strong relationship and going straight away to the second tier, third tier, and creating a new relationship at the expense of their current relationship, it actually hurts Apple as well. So from Apple's perspective, the way to do this would be to actually engage your first tier supplier in the process, rather than completely circumventing them and making them understand the reason why we do this. And in turn, Intel should benefit when you create the right category strategy for yourself. Intel can then adapt their strategy accordingly, etc. So in that way, it is evolving, right? So it's not that there is a win-lose kind of scenario here. In fact, I think in visibility's front, everybody gains by having visibility of the network.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so if there's no other question, then we're going to meet next on Wednesday, and we will start with Unit 2, spend analysis, and there will be a discussion on case as well as some content. So looking forward to that. Have a good one, and see you on Wednesday.